Wyoming wind carved ice from the sky, burying Silas Holt's world under a shroud of white. Alone in his creaking ranch house, the silence was a weight. Then, through the blizzard's roar, a figure emerged, small, stumbling, barefoot in the killing cold. Who walks into a frozen hell, barefoot? The storm had been building for days, a gray bruise swelling on the horizon before finally splitting open over the Wind River Valley. Snow fell not in flakes, but in relentless wind-driven sheets, scouring the land, piling in drifts against the sagging barn, and burying the split-rail fences. Silas had meant to mend come spring. Inside the sod-roofed ranch house, the fire in the stone hearth fought a losing battle against the chill seeping through chinked logs. Silas Holt sat in its uncertain glow, the rhythmic scrape of his whetstone along the blade of his skinning knife, the only sound besides the wind's mournful howl and the occasional crackle of burning cedar. He was a man shaped by solitude and hard seasons. 40 winters, maybe more, had etched deep lines around his eyes and mouth, weathered his skin like old saddle leather. His hands, resting on his knees, were broad and scarred, capable of gentling a spooked colt or breaking the neck of a sickly calf. But gentleness hadn't found much purchase in his life lately. 5 years since the fever took Martha and the baby boy who never drew a full breath. 5 years of the ranch shrinking in on him, the work a grinding monotony punctuated only by the relentless demands of the animals and the vast indifferent emptiness of the Wyoming territory, stretching out beyond his meager holdings. He'd nailed the notice to the post outside Gable's Mercantile in Whiskey Creek 3 weeks prior, driven by a cold, practical desperation. Help wanted, farmhand, room and board, steady work for a strong back. He hadn't expected much. Whiskey Creek was small, and able-bodied men either had their own spread or worked the bigger ranches down south. Mostly, he expected silence, another failure absorbed into the quiet. The storm made the notion of anyone answering laughable. Yet, the knock came. Not loud, not demanding. A hesitant, almost ghostly rapping, barely audible over the wind's shriek. Silas froze, the whetstone halting mid-stroke. Had he imagined it? The wind could play tricks, make rafters groan like voices. He waited, listening intently. It came again, tap, 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 faint, insistent, from the front door. Pushing himself up, his joints protesting, Silas moved cautiously. He lifted the heavy wooden latch, the iron cold even through his calluses, and pulled the door open just enough against the driving snow. The blast of frigid air stole his breath, and there she stood. She couldn't have been more than 16, maybe 17. Thin as a sapling whipped by the wind, her threadbare dress, more gray than any discernible color, plastered to her shivering frame. A worn shawl, utterly inadequate, was clutched tight around narrow shoulders. Her hair, dark and tangled, was matted with snow. Her face was pale, etched with exhaustion and cold so profound it looked like pain. But her eyes, wide in the startling gray-green of sage after rain, met his with a directness that cut through the shock. They held no pleading, only a fierce, almost animal determination. And below the ragged hem of her dress, nothing. Feet, raw and red, buried nearly to the ankles in the drift piled against his doorstep. Bare feet in a Wyoming blizzard. Silas stared, dumbfounded. The absurdity, the sheer impossibility of it, rooted him to the spot. The wind howled between them, swirling snow into the dim warmth of the cabin. "Farmhand," she said, her voice a rasp, thin and brittle as old paper, yet clear. She gestured vaguely behind her, towards the invisible road swallowed by the storm. Saw the notice. In town. Silas found his voice, gruff with disuse and disbelief. You walked from Whiskey Creek in this, with... His gaze dropped again to her feet, then snapped back to her face. Where are your boots, girl? A flicker of something, defiance, shame, crossed her features. Didn't have any. The simplicity of the statement, delivered without inflection, was more jarring than any elaborate tale. She swayed slightly, her knuckles white where she gripped the shawl. The unnatural stillness that follows shock settled over Silas. Practicality warred with profound unease. Turning her away was death sentence, plain and simple. The storm showed no sign of relenting, but letting a strange barefoot girl into his solitary refuge, every instinct honed by years of hardship screamed caution. The wind shoved against the door, spraying them both with icy crystals. The girl flinched, a full-body shudder racking her. Silas saw the blue tinge to her lips. One night, he said abruptly, the words rough. You stay the night. Storm's too bad. Get warm. Then, we'll talk in the morning. He stepped back, pulling the door wider. Get in. Before you freeze solid on my step. She didn't hesitate, stumbling forward over the threshold with a gasp that was half relief, half agony, as the comparative warmth hit her frozen skin. She stood just inside, dripping melted snow onto the packed earth floor, shivering violently, looking utterly lost and out of place amidst the sparse masculine furnishings, the rough-hewn table, the single ladder-backed chair, the narrow cot against the far wall. Silas closed the door, plunging them into a sudden tense quiet broken only by the fire's crackle and the muffled fury of the storm outside. The air felt thick with unspoken questions. He pointed stiffly towards the hearth. Stand there. Get warm. I'll fetch a blanket. He moved past her, the space suddenly feeling cramped, acutely aware of her presence, her silent vulnerability. He pulled a thick, scratchy wool blanket from a trunk near his cot and thrust it towards her. Wrap up. She took it, fingers clumsy with cold, pulling it tight around her shoulders, burrowing into its coarse embrace. She inched closer to the fire, her raw feet leaving damp prints on the floor. Silas busied himself, adding another log to the blaze, avoiding looking directly at her. The silence stretched, heavy and awkward. He filled a dented tin cup from the kettle steaming at the hearth's edge and handed it to her. Water, hot. She accepted it with both hands, cradling it for warmth before taking a small, cautious sip. Her eyes closed briefly. Thank you, she whispered, the sound barely audible. What's your name, girl? Silas asked, leaning against the heavy table, arms crossed. Elara, she said, opening her eyes. They held his gaze steadily again, that unnerving directness returning now that the worst edge of the cold was receding. Elara Finch. Silas Holt. He jerked his head towards the land outside. This is the Holt place. Another pause. Where you from, Elara Finch? East, she said, vague as smoke. A ways. She offered nothing more, turning her attention back to the cup in her hands, her expression closing like a door. Frustration prickled at Silas, warring with a reluctant thread of pity. A barefoot girl named Finch blown in on an eastern wind, offering nothing but her name and a claim on work she looked too frail for. He grunted, turning away. Hungry? She nodded, almost imperceptibly. He cut thick slices from a loaf of yesterday's bread and hacked off a wedge of hard cheese, placing them on a chipped plate which he set on the table. Eat. He didn't sit with her. He retreated to the chair by the fire, picking up his knife and stone again, the rhythmic scraping a familiar anchor in the strange new tension of the room. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She ate slowly, methodically, like someone used to making small rations last. She kept the blanket wrapped tight. Later, when the meager meal was done, the silence returned, less brittle now, but still charged. The storm raged on. Silas knew sleep wouldn't come easy tonight. He gestured towards the cot. "You take that, I'll bunk by the fire." She looked at the cot, then back at him, a flicker of surprise in those gray-green eyes. "Sir, I can just do it," he cut her off, his tone brooking no argument. "You're near frozen through. Get some rest." He spread his own bedroll on the floor near the hearthstones, his back to her. He heard the rustle of the blanket, the soft creak of the cot as she settled. He stared into the flames, the image of her bare, ravaged feet in the snowdrift seared into his mind. Who was she? What desperate circumstance drove a girl onto the open plains in winter with no shoes, and what trouble might be trailing behind her? The questions swirled like the snow outside, offering no answers, only a deepening unease that settled over his loneliness like a new, unfamiliar weight. The wind moaned around the eaves, a sound that now felt less like emptiness and more like a warning. Sleep, when it finally came, was thin and restless, haunted by the ghost of a barefoot girl standing in a blizzard's heart. The blizzard's fury spent itself sometime before dawn, leaving behind a world muffled and transformed. Silas woke stiffly on the hard floor by the hearth, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The oppressive roar of the wind had been replaced by an immense, brittle silence, broken only by the soft plink of melting snow dripping from the eaves outside. Gray light seeped through the small, ice-fringed window. His first conscious thought was of the girl. He turned his head cautiously. Elara lay on the narrow cot, the scratchy wool blanket pulled up to her chin, her dark hair a tangled halo on the rough pillow. She slept deeply, her breathing slow and even, the stark pallor of the previous night replaced by a healthier flush on her cheeks. For a moment in the quiet gloom, she looked startlingly young, almost childlike, the fierce determination of her arrival softened by exhaustion and the vulnerability of sleep. The sight stirred an uncomfortable tenderness in Silas, a feeling long buried under layers of grief and isolation. He pushed it down, the unease from the night returning like a cold draft. Who slept so soundly in a stranger's house after walking barefoot through a killing storm? He rose quietly, adding split logs to the embers, coaxing a new flame to life. The chill in the cabin was sharp, his breath visible. He pulled on his heavy coat and boots, the routine motions a familiar anchor. He needed air, space, the stark clarity of the morning to think. As he lifted the heavy latch on the door, he glanced back. Elara hadn't stirred. He slipped outside. The world was sculpted snow. Drifts leaned against the barn like frozen waves, burying the lower third of its weathered boards. The split-rail fences were mere suggestions beneath the white blanket. The sky, heavy and overcast, hung low, bleaching the distant peaks of the Wind River Range into ghosts. The air was knife-cold and utterly still, carrying the clean, icy scent of snow and the faint underlying tang of sagebrush buried beneath it. His boots crunched loudly in the pristine silence as he walked towards the barn. The practical needs of survival asserted themselves, checking on the horses, the lone milk cow, the chickens huddled in their coop. The storm's aftermath was work, tangible and demanding, pushing the enigma of the girl temporarily aside. He spent an hour digging paths, breaking ice in the water troughs, forking hay into the stalls. The horses, sturdy bays named Buck and Daisy, greeted him with soft nickers, steam pluming from their nostrils. The cow lowed plaintively. The familiar rhythm of chores, the ache in his muscles from shoveling, began to clear the fog of disquiet. He was hauling a bucket of water from the well when the cabin door opened. Elara stood framed in the doorway, wrapped in her shawl over the dress, the borrowed blanket draped around her shoulders like a cloak. She'd attempted to tame her hair, tying it back with a thin strip of leather she must have had tucked away. Her feet were still bare, though she'd clearly washed them. They looked less raw but were still a mess of scrapes and angry red skin against the frozen ground. She didn't flinch from the cold earth, her gaze sweeping over the snow-choked yard, the barn, the distant white-shrouded plains. Her expression was unreadable, assessing. Silas set the bucket down near the steps. "Mornin'," he grunted, the word hanging awkwardly in the cold air. "Morning, Mr. Holt," she replied, her voice still raspy but stronger. Her eyes met his, that direct gray-green gaze holding steady. The storm passed. "Passed hard," he agreed. He gestured towards the bucket. "Water's fresh. Kettle's hot inside. There's oats." He paused, the unspoken question hanging between them. "What now?" She nodded, stepping down onto the packed snowpath he'd cleared. She moved with a quiet purpose that belied her thin frame and battered feet. "I'll see to the animals," she said, not asking, simply stating it as fact. She walked past him towards the barn, her bare feet leaving distinct prints in the snow beside his boot marks. She didn't hesitate at the barn door, pulling it open against the drifted snow with surprising strength. Silas watched her go, a complex knot tightening in his chest. Gratitude warred with suspicion. Her assumption of work felt presumptuous, yet practical. He followed, slower, stopping just inside the barn door. Elara was already in Daisy's stall. She spoke softly to the mare, a low murmur Silas couldn't catch, running a hand down the horse's neck. Daisy, usually wary of strangers, lowered her head, accepting the touch. Elara picked up the stiff brush Silas had left hanging and began working it over the horse's flank with firm rhythmic strokes, dislodging dried mud and loose hair. She worked with an economy of motion, no wasted effort, her focus absolute. It wasn't the tentative touch of someone unfamiliar, it was the ingrained habit of someone who knew animals and labor. Silas leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You've done this before." She didn't look up, concentrating on a knot in Daisy's mane. "Some." The single word offered nothing. He pushed off the frame and moved towards the workbench cluttered with worn tools and tangled leather. He picked up a harness that needed mending, the stitching frayed where the collar piece met the traces. It was a tedious job he'd been putting off. He found a heavy needle and some waxed thread, his thick fingers clumsy with the fine work. He was struggling to thread the needle when a small, calloused hand appeared beside his. Elara had finished with Daisy and moved silently across the packed earth floor. "Here," she said softly. She took the needle and thread from him. With deft, quick movements, she moistened the thread end between her lips, flattened it, and slipped it through the needle's eye on the first try. She handed it back. Silas stared at the threaded needle in his palm, then at her. A flicker of something, respect, cut through his wariness. "Handy," he muttered. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, there and gone so fast he might have imagined it. She turned her attention to the pile of harnesses. Without a word, she picked up another one, examining the weak spots, her fingers tracing the worn leather with a knowing touch. She found Silas's awl and a scrap of softer leather and began reinforcing a stress point, her movements precise and practiced. They worked in silence for a time, the only sounds the scrape of the awl, the soft rasp of thread through leather, the shifting of the animals in their stalls, and the steady drip-drip of melting snow from the barn roof. The cold air carried the pungent smells of hay, manure, leather, and horse sweat. It was a comfortable silence, born of shared labor, the kind Silas hadn't known since Martha used to sit mending clothes while he worked on gear. The unexpectedness of it, the simple competence of this barefoot stranger, chipped away at the wall he'd built around himself. He stole glances at her profile, the determined set of her jaw, the focused intensity in her eyes. What life carves such quiet strength into a girl so young? Later, back in the cabin warmed by the fire and a pot of simmering beans, they ate in that same quiet. Silas had found an old pair of thick wool socks, too small for him but better than nothing. He tossed them onto the table near her plate. "For your feet, can't have you freezing them off on my account." Elara looked at the socks, then up at him. "Thank you, Mr. Holt." She pulled them on carefully over her tender feet. The simple act felt significant. "You earned your keep today," Silas said gruffly, pushing his empty plate away. "Mending that harness. Saw Daisy took to you." He paused, studying her. "Notice stays open. Room's the lean-to off the barn. It's rough but dry. Stove in there needs tending, but it warms. Works sun up to sundown, every day. No shirking. Pays fair share of what the place makes, plus board. Take it or leave it." Elara held his gaze, her expression unreadable. She didn't smile, but attention seemed to ease from her shoulders. "I'll take it, Mr. Holt." "Silas," he corrected, almost reluctantly. "Mr. Holt was my father." "Silas," she repeated, testing the name. "I'll see to the lean-to." The days that followed settled into a new, tentative rhythm. Elara moved into the small, dusty lean-to, airing it out, patching a hole in the roof with scrap wood and canvas. She rose before dawn, lit the stove in her quarters, and was already tending the animals when Silas emerged. She worked with relentless diligence, mucking stalls, hauling water, chopping wood, her slight frame wielding the axe with surprising efficient power, helping Silas dig out fence posts buried deep by drifts. She learned quickly, asking few questions, observing everything. She ate sparingly but gratefully, her silence less guarded, though her past remained a closed door marked east. Silas found himself watching her, not just with suspicion now, but with a growing, grudging admiration. She possessed a quiet resilience that mirrored the land itself. He caught her once, late afternoon, standing at the edge of the corral, watching the horses with an expression of such profound, unguarded sorrow, it stopped him cold. It vanished the instant she sensed his presence, replaced by her usual composed mask. He began leaving tasks for her, small tests of trust, fetching a specific tool from the barn, counting the chickens. She never failed. One afternoon, wrestling with the bulky hinge on the tack room door, Silas cursed under his breath. Elara appeared beside him, holding a small tin of grease he'd forgotten he owned. "Try this," she offered. As she handed it to him, her sleeve rode up slightly. Silas caught a glimpse of faded parallel lines on the pale skin of her inner forearm, old scars, thin and white, unmistakably deliberate. He froze, his eyes snapping to hers. Elara yanked her sleeve down, her face paling, that fierce defensiveness flashing back into her eyes for a split second before she looked away, busying herself with a bridle. Silas said nothing. He took the grease, applied it, and the hinge moved smoothly. The silence between them thickened, charged with the unspoken question hanging in the dusty air. Those scars spoke of pain, inflicted by another, or perhaps even herself. What darkness had she fled? The fragile peace lasted a week. Silas needed supplies, salt, flour, ammunition. Whiskey Creek beckoned, a necessary intrusion into their isolated world. He hitched Buck to the old wagon, the cold morning air sharp in his lungs. Elara stood watching from the barn door, her expression carefully neutral, but Silas saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her knuckles whitened where she gripped the doorframe. He hadn't asked her to come. Bringing her into town felt like inviting scrutiny he wasn't ready for. "Keep an eye on Daisy," he said gruffly, climbing onto the wagon seat. "Should be back by sundown." She just nodded, her gray-green eyes following him as he drove out of the yard, a solitary figure growing smaller against the vast snowy landscape. Whiskey Creek was its usual self, a single muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings, a handful of bored men lingering outside the saloon, smoke curling from chimneys into the cold sky. Silas kept his business brisk, trading eggs for salt at Gable's Mercantile, buying flour and shells at the gunsmith's. He avoided conversation, offering only curt nods. As he was loading his purchases onto the wagon outside the Mercantile, Tom Gable, the storekeeper, leaned against the porch post. "Here you got yourself some help finally, Silas," Gable remarked, chewing on a toothpick. "Young fella?" Silas hesitated. "Girl." Gable's eyebrows shot up. "A girl. Farmhand? That's a new one. Where'd she blow in from? Didn't see anyone new round here, cept. He trailed off, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Say, there was a fella in here 'bout 4 days back, just after the big blow. Didn't buy nothin', just asked questions, looked hard, wore a long duster, fancy boots covered in mud, had a look in his eye like a hunting hawk. Silas's hand stilled on the sack of flour. What kind of questions? Oh, you know, Gable said, his voice dropping slightly. Had he seen a young girl pass through? 16 or so, dark hair, might be travelin' alone. Said she was kin. Run off, needed finding. Offered a $silver for news. Gable spat the toothpick into the mud. Didn't sit right with me. Told him nope, hadn't seen hide nor hair. He didn't linger. Headed north out of town. He looked meaningfully down the road that led, eventually towards Silas's spread. That your girl, Silas? She in some kind of trouble? Silas's blood ran cold. The man's description, the hawk-like look, the fancy boots, the timing, it fit. He thought of Elara's raw feet, her fierce independence, the terror beneath her composure, the scars on her arm. Kin. The word felt like a lie. Don't know what you're talking about, Tom, Silas said, his voice flat. Just hired help, paid her wages. He finished loading the wagon with deliberate slowness, avoiding Gable's curious gaze. He drove out of town faster than he'd arrived, Buck sensing his urgency. The familiar landscape seemed suddenly menacing. The hawk-eyed man was searching. He'd been close. He might circle back. He might already know. As the ranch came into view late that afternoon, Silas saw Elara splitting wood near the barn, a rhythmic thwack echoing in the still air. Relief warred with a new, sharper dread. He pulled the wagon into the yard. She stopped chopping, wiping sweat from her brow with her sleeve. Watching him approach, her expression was questioning, alert. Silas climbed down, his movements stiff. He walked towards her, stopping a few feet away. The silence stretched, heavy with what he now knew. He saw the flicker of apprehension in her eyes. Had a talk with Tom Gable, Silas said, his voice low and gravelly. He kept his gaze steady on hers, watching for the reaction. Fella came into the mercantile, 4 days back, after the storm, looking for a girl. Elara went utterly still, the color drained from her face. The axe slipped from her grasp, thudding dully into the chipped wood at her feet. Her hands, suddenly trembling, clenched into fists at her sides. Her gray-green eyes, wide with a terror far deeper than anything the blizzard had evoked, locked onto his. Not defiance now, but a raw, animal fear. The carefully maintained wall around her shattered, revealing the hunted creature beneath. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The answer was written in every stricken line of her body. The hawk had found the scent, and Silas Holt, the lonely rancher who wanted nothing but solitude, now stood between the hunter and his prey. The silence after Silas's words hung like ice in the frigid air. Eleanor didn't move. Her face, drained of color, seemed carved from the same pale limestone that jutted from the distant hills. The raw terror in her gray-green eyes was a physical thing, a trapped animal staring down the barrel. Her trembling hands clenched tighter, knuckles white against the rough fabric of her dress. She didn't deny it. She didn't run. She just stood, frozen, waiting for the blow. Silas felt the weight of her fear press against his chest. His instinct, honed by years of solitude, was to demand answers, to push the stranger and her troubles right back out into the snow. But seeing her like this, the fierce resilience he'd come to grudgingly admire shattered into pure, unadulterated dread, stirred something else entirely, a protective impulse he hadn't felt since Martha. It warred fiercely with his ingrained caution. Inside, he said finally, his voice rough but lacking its usual edge. It wasn't a request. He turned and walked towards the cabin, not looking back, trusting she'd follow or flee. He heard the faint crunch of snow behind him, hesitant at first, then quicker. She followed. The warmth of the cabin felt cloying after the biting cold. Silas stirred the embers in the hearth, adding a log, the crackle loud in the tense quiet. Eleanor stood just inside the door, arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring at the floorboards as if they held answers. The borrowed wool socks seemed absurdly inadequate against the enormity of the moment. Silas didn't sit. He leaned against the heavy table, arms crossed, watching her. "That man," he stated, "he looking for you." Eleanor flinched as if struck. A tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Her throat worked, but no sound came out. "Kin?" Silas pressed, remembering Gable's word. It tasted sour. Her head snapped up, eyes flashing with sudden fierce bitterness. "No." The single syllable was sharp, brittle, carrying a world of pain. "Not kin." She looked away again, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken horrors. Silas waited, demanding more felt like kicking a wounded dog. He's why I had no shoes," she whispered finally, the words barely audible, dragged from some deep dark place. "Ran. Through things. Didn't stop." Her hand unconsciously brushed her forearm, hidden beneath her sleeve, where the thin white scars lay. A memory flickered in her eyes, not of the running, but of the source of the scars. Silas saw it, a fleeting image of controlled cruelty, not the chaos of flight. He didn't ask. The haunted look on her face was answer enough. She'd run from a predator, one who marked his property. Silas exhaled slowly, the sound loud in the quiet. The image of the hawk-eyed man solidified in his mind, cold, relentless, a hunter, and Elara was the quarry who'd somehow made it to his doorstep. His isolated ranch was no longer a refuge, it was a target. The weight of responsibility settled on him, heavy and unfamiliar. Turning her out was unthinkable now, but harboring her, that invited a storm far worse than any blizzard. "Right," he said, the word heavy with unspoken acceptance. "You stay close, inside the fence line. No wanderin'." It wasn't permission, it was an order born of necessity. "We keep eyes open." The next few days were charged with a brittle tension. The work continued. The ranch demanded it, but the rhythm was different. Silas moved with a new alertness, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon line where the snowy plains met the gray sky. He checked the rifle above the mantel more often, ensuring it was clean and loaded. Elara worked with a quiet intensity, her movements sharp, her own eyes frequently darting towards the trail leading to Whiskey Creek. She rarely spoke, retreating further into herself, the shadows under her eyes deepening. Yet she was there at dawn, mucking stalls, hauling water, her small frame driven by a desperate need to earn her keep, to prove she wasn't just trouble. Spring was fighting a slow, muddy battle against the lingering winter. Patches of bare earth began to show through the snow, revealing the frost-heaved ground beneath. The fence along the western pasture, already weakened by the blizzard drifts, needed urgent repair before the cattle could be turned out. Several posts leaned drunkenly, rails snapped or missing. One crisp morning, the air smelling of damp earth and thawing manure, Silas loaded tools onto the small sled, a heavy maul, a crowbar, replacement split rails he'd cut the previous fall. He glanced at Elara, who was watching him, a question in her eyes. "Fence line," he said. "West pasture, needs fixin'. Come on." It was the first time he'd explicitly included her in a task beyond the barnyard. She nodded, pulling on the thick socks and a pair of oversized work gloves Silas had unearthed. They walked in silence, pulling the sled through the slushy snow. The vastness of the land felt different now, not just empty, but watchful. Reaching the damaged section, Silas assessed the work. One post was rotten at the base. "Gotta pull this one," he grunted, handing Elara the crowbar. "Lever it loose once I get it started." He positioned the maul and began driving the crowbar's wedge end deep beside the post's base, the heavy thwack echoing in the stillness. The earth, still partially frozen, resisted. Elara watched his movements, her brow furrowed in concentration. When he stepped back, breathing hard, she stepped forward without a word. She positioned the crowbar differently, angling it under the post's root flare, bracing her boot clad only in sock against a solid chunk of frozen ground. She threw her slight weight against the bar, using leverage rather than brute force. There was a groan of protesting wood and earth, and the post shifted visibly. Silas raised an eyebrow. "Where'd you learn that?" She kept her focus on the bar, straining. My mother." The words were hesitant, the first time she'd mentioned family unprompted. "Had a garden. Rocks, big ones." She gave another heave. The post tilted further. "She showed me how to move what seems too heavy." A flicker of profound sadness crossed her face, quickly masked. Silas remembered the scars. Had the mother been the source of strength, or the reason Elara knew how to withstand pressure? He moved to help, adding his strength to the crowbar. With a final sucking pull, the rotten post came free. They worked side by side for hours, digging the new post hole in the cold mud, setting the fresh timber, hammering it solid with the maul, then lashing the replacement rails into place with rawhide strips. Silas showed her how to notch the rails for a tighter fit, how to test the post's stability. She learned quickly, her hands, though small, surprisingly strong and sure. The shared labor, the physical exertion against the tangible problem of the broken fence, created a fragile bridge between them. Words were scarce, but the silence felt less charged, more companionable. Silas found himself pointing out the early signs of spring, a hardy purple crocus pushing through the snowmelt, the different tracks of rabbit and coyote in the mud. Elara listened, her gaze occasionally losing its hunted look, softening as she watched a hawk circle high above. One afternoon, returning from repairing another section, they passed the small spring-fed creek that cut through the north edge of Silas's land. It was running high and fast with snowmelt, the water clear and cold. Silas stopped to refill his canteen. As he knelt by the bank, something caught his eye, partially obscured by a tangle of winter-bare willow branches. A footprint, not from his worn boot, nor Elara's sock-clad foot. A boot print, large, deeply impressed into the soft mud at the very edge of the water. The heel was distinct, narrow, and sharp-edged, not the rounded heel of a working rancher. It looked new, the edges still crisp, unfilled by meltwater. Silas froze. He gestured sharply for Elara to stay back. His hand instinctively went to the pistol holstered at his hip. He scanned the opposite bank, the thickets, the rise beyond. Nothing moved but the rushing water and the wind in the willows. He studied the print. The stride indicated the person had been moving parallel to the creek, heading east, skirting the edge of his property. Observing, Elara had crept closer, her face pale again. She saw the print, her breath catching in a tiny gasp. She knew that tread. Her eyes darted wildly towards the distant line of low hills to the east, her hand flying to her mouth, stifling a sound. Silas straightened slowly, his jaw tight. The hawk-eyed man hadn't just passed through Whiskey Creek, he'd been here, close, scouting, the fragile piece of the past days shattered. The predator was circling. Later, back at the cabin, the tension was a live wire. Silas cleaned his rifle methodically at the table, the smell of gun oil sharp in the air. Elara paced near the hearth, restless, unable to sit. The specter of the boot print hung between them. As dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and oranges, Silas spoke, his voice low and grim. "We need to know if he's still out there, camped close, watching." He looked directly at Elara. "You know his ways, where he might hole up? Think." Elara stopped pacing, wrapping her arms around herself. She stared into the fire, her expression a battlefield of fear and concentration. He likes high ground," she whispered, her voice trembling. "To see, Doesn't like wet or open ground where he can be seen. She swallowed hard. There's an old line shack, northeast, abandoned, on the rise near the big bluff, overlooks this valley. She finally met Silas's gaze, her eyes wide with dawning horror at what she'd just revealed. He knew about places like that, used them before. Silas's blood ran cold. He knew that shack, a crumbling, half-rotted structure on the high ridge, a relic from the early cattle drives. It had a clear view straight down to his ranch yard. If the man was there— Without a word, Silas stood, slinging the cleaned rifle over his shoulder. He grabbed his heavy coat and a lantern. "Stay here," he ordered Elara, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. You hear shots, you get down in the root cellar. Stay hid." Elara nodded, her face pale as parchment. "Silas." The sound of his name on her lips, filled with raw fear, stopped him at the door. He looked back. She was clutching something small and dark in her hand, a smooth, river-worn stone he'd absent-mindedly picked up by the creek days ago and left on the mantel. She held it like a talisman. He gave a curt nod, then stepped out into the deepening twilight. The air was cold and still, the first stars pricking through the violet sky. He moved silently, not towards the barn, but angling northeast, towards the shadowed rise where the old line shack perched. The snow crunched faintly under his boots, each sound suddenly magnified in the immense quiet. The image of the sharp-heeled boot print by the creek burned in his mind. He crested a small rise, the bulk of the bluff looming ahead. He could just make out the darker patch against the skyline where the shack stood. He paused, scanning. Nothing. He took another step forward, sinking slightly into a drift. Then he froze. The same sharp heel pointed directly towards the shack, and leading away from it, back towards the creek, was a second set, overlapping, recent. He wasn't just watching, he was coming down. Silas snapped his gaze towards the ranch, now a cluster of dark shapes in the valley below. The lantern light in the cabin window looked terribly small, terribly exposed. A cold certainty gripped him. The hunter wasn't just circling anymore. He was closing in for the kill. Right now. Silas broke into a run, plunging down the slope towards home, the rifle heavy in his hands, the icy air burning his lungs. He had to get back, before the hawk reached the dove. Silas ran. Down the slope, through the clutching drifts and treacherous patches of slick mud, lungs burning with the cold, sharp air. Each stride pounded with the rhythm of the tracks he'd seen, sharp-heeled, predatory, aimed straight at his home, at Elara. The image of her pale, terrified face when he'd left spurred him faster, overriding the ache in his legs. The rifle, slung across his back, thumped against his spine like a frantic heartbeat. He burst into the ranch yard, scanning wildly. The cabin door was closed, no sign of forced entry. He skidded to a halt, breath rasping, hand instinctively going to the pistol at his hip. "Elara," he called, his voice rough with exertion. "You all right?" The door cracked open, revealing a sliver of her face, eyes wide and dark with fear in the lantern light spilling out. "Silas." Relief washed over her features, quickly replaced by fresh dread at his expression. "What happened?" "He's close," Silas gasped, striding towards the door, pushing past her into the relative warmth. He bolted it behind him. "Tracks, fresh, coming down from the ridge, heading this way." He shrugged off the rifle, leaning it against the wall near the door, within easy reach. Saw the shack. Place is empty now, but he was there, watched us. He turned to her, his gaze intense. "He knows you're here." Elara wrapped her arms tightly around herself, sinking onto the edge of the cot. The smooth river stone she'd clutched earlier lay discarded on the blanket. She looked small, impossibly young, the fierce resilience momentarily crushed under the weight of imminent danger. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words choked. "I shouldn't have brought this on you." Silas didn't answer immediately. He moved to the window, peering out into the gathering dusk. The yard was quiet, shadows deepening, empty, for now. The vulnerability of the place struck him anew, the flimsy door, the thin walls, the miles of empty land offering no refuge, only hiding places for a hunter. He couldn't just wait, he needed her to be able to do more than hide. "Sorry, don't mend fences," he said finally, turning back to her. His voice was gruff, but the edge had softened, "and hiding only works till you're found. Need you to know how to protect yourself." He walked to the trunk near his bed, the one that held Martha's things he hadn't touched in years. He lifted the lid, the smell of cedar and faint lavender momentarily filling the air. Beneath folded linens lay a long oilcloth-wrapped bundle. He pulled it out, the weight familiar and heavy. Unwrapping it revealed a single-action Colt revolver, its blued steel worn but well-maintained, resting in a simple leather holster. Martha's gun. Bought for her when he'd gone on long cattle drives, a final defense against the solitude and its dangers. He'd cleaned it every month, like clockwork, a ritual of remembrance. He held it out towards Elara, grip first. "Know what this is?" She stared at it, then up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "A gun. Yep, a 44. Got a kick, but it's simple. Point, pull the hammer back, squeeze the trigger." He placed it carefully on the table beside the river stone. Martha's. She knew how to use it. The name hung in the air, a shared acknowledgement of another loss, another woman who'd needed defending. "Can't be with you every minute. Need you to know this. If he comes, if I'm not here, you point it and you shoot. Understand?" Elara looked from the gun to Silas's face, searching for something, finding only grim necessity. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and touched the cold steel of the barrel, then the worn wooden grip. Her fingers traced the checkering. He had a gun like this, bigger, shiny. Her voice was a thread. "He made me hold it once, said it was power." A shudder ran through her. "He laughed when I dropped it. It was heavy, so heavy." Her gaze flickered to her scarred forearm, a silent connection made. Power hurts. Silas felt a cold fury settle in his gut. "This ain't about hurtin' for the sake of it, girl. This is about stoppin' the hurt, about surviving." He picked up the revolver, broke it open, showing her the empty chambers. "See, empty now, safe to handle. First thing, always know if it's loaded, always." His movements were deliberate, patient, as he showed her how to check, how to hold it, how to sight down the barrel. He talked her through the mechanics, the cylinder, the hammer, the trigger pull. He didn't expect her to be a marksman, just to understand the terrible finality the weapon represented, and how to unleash it if cornered. As she tentatively lifted the gun, her small hand struggling with its weight, the lantern light caught the faint tremor in her arms, not just from the gun's heft, but from the memory it invoked. "His name," she whispered suddenly, her eyes fixed on the revolver in her hands, not looking at Silas. "Creedy, Josiah Creedy." The name tasted like ash. He wasn't kin, he was. My mother worked for him. Big house, back east. He was kind, at first, then, not. She finally looked up, her gray-green eyes haunted pools. "He said I said Mama ran off, left me. But I saw the carpet in his study, the stain near the hearthrug. He moved it, but I saw." A tear escaped, tracing a path down her dusty cheek. "He said I belonged to him then, like a stray dog." Her knuckles whitened on the gun grip. "The scars, that was when I said no. The first time I said no." Silas stood very still. The pieces clicked into a horrifying picture. Not just a runaway but an escapee from something monstrous. The weight of protecting her felt suddenly immense, a crushing responsibility he hadn't asked for but couldn't abandon. He reached out, not touching her, but his hand hovering near the gun. "You put that down now, Elara, carefully. You know enough for tonight." His voice was low, thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Rage at Creedy, grief for the girl and her mother, a fierce protective resolve that anchored him. "He won't get you, not while I draw breath." The next morning dawned gray and damp, the snow retreating rapidly, turning the ranch yard into a churned mess of mud and half-frozen slush. The tension was a living thing, coiling around them as they did the morning chores, both constantly scanning the horizon, listening for the sound of a horse that didn't belong. Silas kept the rifle close, propped against the barn wall as he mended a harness. Elara carried Martha's revolver, unloaded but heavy in the deep pocket of the oversized work coat Silas had given her, a tangible weight and reminder. They were repairing a hinge on the chicken coop when the sound came, not hoofbeats from the open plain, but the rhythmic jingle of harness and the groan of wagon wheels from the direction of Whiskey Creek. Silas straightened, wiping grease from his hands, his gaze sharp. Elara froze, her face draining of color, her hand instinctively moving towards her pocket. Tom Gable's supply wagon rolled into the yard, but it wasn't just Tom. Sitting beside him, looking distinctly uncomfortable, perched on the hard wooden seat, was Deputy Eli Vance. Young, earnest, and painfully aware of his limited authority in the vast territory, Vance wore his tin star like it weighed a ton. Tom reined in the horses, his expression a mix of apology and nervous curiosity. Vance climbed down, adjusting his hat, his eyes immediately scanning the yard, lingering on Elara, who had shrunk back towards the coop door. "Mornin', Silas," Tom called too heartily. "Brought your order, salt, flour, them nails you wanted." He busied himself with the reins, avoiding Silas's hard stare. Deputy Vance approached, trying for an air of official calm. "Mr. Holt, Tom mentioned you'd taken on some new help." He nodded towards Elara. "This the young lady?" Silas stepped forward, placing himself subtly between Vance and Elara. "She is. Name's Elara Finch. Does her share." His tone was flat, unwelcoming. Vance cleared his throat. "Right. Well, Mr. Holt, reason I'm out here, we had a report. Fella came through Whiskey Creek a couple weeks back, asking after a missing girl. Description matched." He looked pointedly at Elara. "Said she was family. Needed to find her, make sure she was safe. Name of Creedy, Josiah Creedy." Silas felt Elara flinch behind him. He saw the deputy's eyes narrow slightly, noting the reaction. "He say why she was missing?" Silas asked, his voice dangerously low. "Said she was confused, upset after a family tragedy, worried she might come to harm out here alone." Vance shifted his weight. "Just doing my duty, Mr. Holt, checking on her welfare, seeing if she wants to go home." He took a step towards Elara. "Miss, everything all right here? This man treating you well?" Elara looked like a cornered rabbit. Her eyes darted from Vance to Silas, wide with panic. She opened her mouth but no sound came out. Silas saw the terror warring with the instinct to run, the revolver a cold lump in her pocket. "She's fine," Silas stated firmly, stepping fully into Vance's path. "Working for wages. Got a roof, food. Ain't confused. Just quiet." He met Vance's gaze squarely. "Man like Creedy. He show you any proof, papers, anything?" Vance flushed slightly. "Well, no. But he seemed concerned. Respectable. Respectable men don't hunt barefoot girls across Wyoming in a blizzard," Silas said flatly. The words hung heavy in the muddy air. Tom Gable looked down at his hands. Vance's jaw tightened. "Be that as it may, Mr. Holt," Vance said, his voice hardening with official resolve, "I need to hear it from her." "Miss Finch? "Do you wish to return with Mr. Creedy, or stay here?" The question was a trap. Silas felt it. If she said stay, Vance might pry, might ask why she ran, might inadvertently lead Creedy right to her. If she said nothing, it looked like coercion. Elara trembled, her hand now clenched tightly over the pocket holding the gun. She looked at Silas, a silent plea for guidance, for rescue. Silas made his decision. He couldn't let Vance take her, not even for questioning. The risk was too great. "She stays," he declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. "She's under my protection, Deputy. Creedy wants her. He deals with me." He planted his feet, a solid barrier between the lawman and the girl. "You got no cause, no proof of any wrong. Now if you're done, Tom's got supplies to unload, and we got work." Vance's face tightened. He wasn't used to being defied. He looked past Silas at Elara's terrified face, then back at the resolute rancher. He touched the brim of his hat. "This ain't over, Holt. Creedy filed a report. He'll be back, with more than just questions, maybe." He turned stiffly and climbed back onto the wagon beside a deeply uncomfortable Tom Gable. "Unload the goods, Tom. We're leaving." As the wagon rattled out of the yard, Silas watched it go, the knot in his stomach tightening. He'd just drawn a line in the mud, against Creedy, and now against the law. He turned back to Elara. She was shaking violently, tears silently streaming down her face. "He knows," she gasped, her voice raw with terror. "He used the law. He'll come back. He'll—" Her words dissolved into helpless sobs. Silas moved towards her, an awkward gesture of comfort half formed, but before he could reach her, a sound cut through the damp morning air, a low, clear whistle. Not a bird, not the wind, a deliberate carrying signal. It came from the edge of the tree line, just beyond the northern pasture fence. Both Silas and Elara froze, their heads snapping towards the sound. Silas's hand flew to his pistol. Elara's breath hitched in a strangled gasp. Her eyes, wide with dawning, absolute horror, fixed on a figure standing just within the shadow of the pines. Tall, wearing a long duster, his face obscured by distance and shadow, but the posture was unmistakable, relaxed, predatory, observing. He lifted a hand, not in greeting but in a slow, mocking wave. Then, his voice, cold and carrying across the muddy distance, rang out clear as a bell. "Afternoon, Elara. Found you. Told you running was pointless. Your mother learned that lesson the hard way, didn't she?" Creedy's words hung in the damp air like poison smoke. "Your mother learned that lesson the hard way, didn't she?" The casual cruelty in his tone, the confirmation of Elara's deepest horror, struck like a physical blow. She staggered back against the chicken coop, a choked sob escaping her. Silas moved instantly, stepping fully in front of her, his hand drawing his pistol in one smooth motion. The Colt's hammer clicked back, the sound shockingly loud in the sudden silence. "Far enough, Creedy," Silas barked, his voice rough as granite. He leveled the pistol, his gaze locked on the shadowed figure at the tree line. "This ends now. You walk away, or you don't walk at all." Creedy chuckled, a low, humorless sound that carried across the muddy yard. He took one deliberate step forward, emerging slightly from the pine's gloom. He was tall, lean beneath the long duster, with a face that might have been handsome once but was now sharpened by cruelty. His eyes dark and predatory. Tom Gable's hawk description was chillingly apt. A polished revolver gleamed at his hip. "Ends. It ends when I say it ends, rancher. The girl belongs to me, always has. Her mother understood that too, eventually." He smirked, his gaze sliding past Silas to Elara's trembling form. "Didn't she, Elara? Remember how she finally stopped fighting?" Elara whimpered, pressing her back harder against the rough wood. Silas felt her terror radiating like heat. He didn't turn, didn't take his eyes off Creedy, but his voice dropped, low and urgent. Elara, inside. Now, bar the door. Creedy took another step. She won't go. She knows running just makes it worse. She learned that lesson young, didn't you, girl? Took a few tries, but you learned. His hand drifted casually towards his own holster. One more step, Silas warned, his finger tightening on the trigger, and I put you down. The standoff crackled. Mud sucked at Creedy's fine boots as he paused, his eyes calculating. He'd expected fear, submission, not this weathered rancher standing like a stone wall. You think you can stop me, old man? The law says she's mine. The law out here is what a man makes it, Silas growled, and I say she's free. Deputy Vance heard your lies. He'll be back. Creedy's smirk widened. Vance? That boy? He's likely halfway to Laramie by now, chasing rustlers. Took a little coin to point him in the wrong direction. Just you, me, and the girl now. He took another step, his hand now resting on his pistol grip. Last chance, rancher. Step aside. Silas didn't hesitate. He fired. The shot cracked like thunder, kicking mud and slush up just inches from Creedy's advancing boot. Creedy flinched violently, his composure shattering into startled rage. You fool, he snarled, yanking his own revolver free. But in that split second of distraction, Elara moved, not towards the cabin, but sideways, towards the open barn door. Silas, she cried, her voice raw but clear. The loft, the hay drop. Silas understood instantly. He fired again, not at Creedy, but high, forcing the man to duck instinctively behind a gnarled old cedar stump near the tree line. Silas used the cover of the shot to sprint towards the barn, diving through the door just as Creedy's return shot splintered the wood frame above his head. Inside the barn, the air was thick with dust and the smell of hay and animals. Daisy snorted nervously in her stall. Silas scrambled up the ladder to the hayloft. Below, he heard Elara's bare feet whisper across the packed earth floor, then the sound of her dragging something heavy, the old anvil from the forge corner. She positioned it directly beneath the hay chute trapdoor. Silas reached the loft. The heavy trapdoor, used for dropping hay bales to the floor below, was secured by a thick rope looped around a cleat. Creedy's furious shouts came from outside, approaching the barn door. Come out, rancher. Hiding won't save her. Silas saw Elara below, crouched behind the anvil, Martha's Colt clutched tightly in both hands, her eyes wide but focused, fixed on the barn entrance. She looked up at him, nodding once. The terror was still there, but beneath it, a fierce, desperate resolve. She was buying him time. She was fighting. Creedy kicked the barn door open, silhouetted against the gray light, pistol sweeping the dim interior. Elara, show yourself, you ungrateful little. Now, Silas, Elara screamed. Silas didn't hesitate. He kicked the cleat, releasing the rope. The heavy trapdoor crashed open, but it wasn't hay that plummeted down the chute. Elara had piled loose, dusty burlap sacks and an old rusted milk can onto the platform. The makeshift avalanche roared down, striking Creedy square in the shoulders as he stepped inside. He stumbled forward with a curse, blinded by dust and debris, his shot going wild, splintering a stall post. Silas was already moving. He swung down from the loft, landing hard but rolling to his feet, his rifle forgotten but his pistol still in hand. Creedy, coughing and disoriented, tried to bring his own gun up. Silas was faster. He lunged, not firing, but slamming the heavy barrel of his pistol down onto Creedy's wrist. Bone cracked. Creedy howled, his revolver clattering to the floor. Silas kicked the weapon away, then grabbed Creedy by the collar of his fine shirt, hauling him upright. He slammed him hard against the barn wall. Dust rained down. Creedy's eyes, wide with pain and shock, met Silas's. There was no pity in Silas's gaze, only cold, hard certainty. You touch her again, Silas breathed, his voice dangerously low. You even look at her again, I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth and put you in the ground. You hear me? This land swallows men like you whole. It swallowed my family. It won't swallow her." He shoved Creedy hard. The man stumbled, clutching his broken wrist, gasping for breath, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only the raw, cowering predator beneath. He looked past Silas to where Elara stood, still crouched, the Colt aimed steadily at his chest. Her hands didn't tremble now. Her gray-green eyes held his, not with fear but with a terrifying newfound strength. She had the gun. She had Silas. She wasn't prey anymore. "Get out your horse and ride. If I see your shadow on this land again, I won't warn, I'll shoot." Creedy didn't need telling twice. Scrambling, whimpering, he staggered towards the door, leaving his fine revolver in the dirt. He vanished into the gray afternoon, the sound of a horse being frantically spurred fading rapidly into the distance. Silas lowered his pistol, his shoulders slumping slightly. He turned to Elara. She slowly lowered the Colt, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The fierce mask dissolved, replaced by a wave of trembling exhaustion. She dropped the gun and stumbled towards him. Silas caught her as her legs gave way, holding her upright as silent sobs racked her thin frame. He held her awkwardly, patting her back, the scent of hay dust and her hair filling his senses. It was the first time he'd held anyone since Martha. Later, after the trembling had subsided, they sat on the cabin porch steps, watching the late afternoon sun struggle through the clouds. The air smelled of damp earth and bruised pine needles. Elara held the smooth river stone, turning it over and over in her hand. Silas had retrieved a small worn wooden box from the trunk, Martha's box. Inside, nestled beside a faded lock of dark hair, lay a tiny silver locket, shaped like a sparrow. Martha loved birds, Silas said quietly, his voice rough with unused emotion, said they were free, always moving on. He held the locket out to Elara. "She'd want you to have this, a reminder. You're free now, Elara, truly free." Elara took the locket, her fingers tracing the delicate wings. Tears welled again, but they were different now, not just of fear, but of a profound, aching relief. "My mother, she loved wildflowers," she whispered, "purple ones, like the crocus we saw." She looked out towards the small fenced plot near the cottonwood tree, where Silas had buried Martha and the baby. Not the hunted creature, not just the capable hand, but a survivor, scarred but unbroken. She had fought for her freedom, for this patch of earth, just as he had fought to protect it. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 5 years hadn't vanished, but it had shifted, making space for something else, something fragile, but fiercely alive. "Aye," he said, a rasp of warmth entering his voice for the first time in years. "We can plant some. Come spring, they'll bloom." He stood, offering his hand. "Work to do. Fences won't mend themselves." Elara slipped the sparrow locket around her neck, the cool metal settling against her skin, a small defiant weight. She took his calloused hand, her own grip firm. The deputy might return with questions. The town might whisper. Creedy might still linger in the shadows of the world. But on this ranch, in the muddy yard scarred by struggle, a new story was taking root. Together, they walked towards the barn, the weight of the past still heavy, but the promise of the fragile, stubborn Wyoming spring blooming in the thawing ground beneath their feet. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the shared rhythm of survival, of home.